Adventist Life Seminar.
Hi, I'd like to welcome you to our second session of Grief Recovery. I told you last week that it would be very, very painful for you to go through that first session and that you'd be tempted to stay home the second session. And I think you agree that it was painful, and I'd like to congratulate you for coming back in spite of that pain. It's very interesting to watch the kinds of people that come to grief recovery and the kinds of losses that are represented. Some people think that the only kinds of losses that are represented in grief recovery programs are loss through death. But this is not really true. We're finding that a fair number of people come because they've lost through divorce. Now, it's true that some of the reactions are the same, but the reactions have a greater intensity in some respects among those who are losing or have lost through divorce. And then, of course, we have some folk coming to grief recovery because they have given birth to a child with a defect. It's interesting to me, as I work in maternity wards and work with people in grief recovery, that when a person has, or a couple have a baby with a defect, they really have to say goodbye to the baby they hoped and dreamed to have before they can say hello to the baby they received. We also have some folk who come to grief recovery because they had a stillbirth. Some people think that's rather strange, and they say, well, look, the baby was never alive. Why are you so concerned? I mean, it wasn't born alive. But we're discovering that when people are expecting a baby, they begin a bonding process with that unborn child from the very time it is conceived. And they have a relationship of sorts with that child by the time the stillbirth takes place, and they must make an adjustment, a big adjustment. And then we have people who are losing eyesight. We had one lady come to grief recovery. She was not only losing her eyesight, she lost her husband a few months before. So she had a double loss that she was working through. And then that's the loss of hearing. Some people come because they are losing their hearing or have lost their hearing. It's interesting, I have a very dear friend who has always had about an 80% loss in hearing from the time she was born. And she has just now received a hearing aid and can hear birds singing for the first time, can hear violins playing on the stereo for the first time. Now, can you reverse that and imagine a person who has heard all their life and suddenly they realize they are not going to be able to hear birds and violins and good music? That's a major adjustment to make. And so we have people coming to grief recovery who've lost their hearing or are losing their hearing. You have people who are losing a limb or have lost a limb, couples who are losing through miscarriage. It's always interesting to listen to people talk about miscarriage. They talk about it in terms of the mother losing the baby through miscarriage, but I believe mother and father both lose. If it takes a mother and father to conceive, then certainly a mother and father would experience a loss at the time of a miscarriage. I can still remember how disappointed my wife was when I came at the time of our miscarriage, and I wasn't very supportive because I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know I was supposed to be upset. I thought she was the one to be upset. It wasn't until years later that we got that straightened out, and I realized that husbands do have to go through a grief process when there's a miscarriage in the family. And then, of course, you have the loss through property. Some people come because they've lost everything they have. One man even came to grief recovery because he had been in prison, and he lost his property, his reputation, his friends, everything. Then you have people who lose their jobs. In times of unemployment, it's very, very common for these people to go through grief, or people who retire. Some companies are now giving pre-retirement seminars to prepare their people for that day when they walk off the job for the last time. We get some of these people in grief recovery. Of course, the one we talk about a lot is the empty nest syndrome, parents losing their children, they're going off to college, getting married. That's a common loss that we see in grief recovery. Now, while all of these kinds of losses produce a similar reaction or similar reactions, it's true that the intensity varies a great deal. Last week, we talked about grief, and we gave a rather complete picture of what grief is all about. And we went into a lot of detail, and tonight I'd just like to kind of back up and review just a wee bit Maybe there's some here at this second session for the first time, and for the benefit of all of us, we need to take a new look at what grief is. Colin Murray Parkes, who is a British psychiatrist who did a great deal of work in grief among adults, tells us that one of the first things that happens when a person loses a major relationship in his or her life is numbness or shock. They just can't believe that it happened. And then when the reality begins to set in, and the person realizes, yes, it really did happen, then they begin to yearn and search for the person who has died. And they search incessantly for this person. They want to preserve the person, they want to preserve the relationship. But it's also very interesting that underlying this searching, there is a basic sadness, because the person realizes that even though they're looking for and searching for the individual, they really aren't going to find him or her. And when they come to the realization that they are not going to find the person, then they go into what Parkes calls disorganization and despair. They give up their recovery attempts, and they feel hopeless, they feel helpless. In other words, they feel depressed. But if they can work this through and they can talk about their feelings with adequate support, gradually they will begin to reorganize their life, and they will begin to build their own identity again, set new goals for their life, and go on. Now, I'd like to just share a little definition of grief that I've come up with after reading Eric Lindemann's definition of grief. I call it the 3 S's of grief. The first S is shock, which Colin Murray Parkes talks about as well. The second S is suffering. This is when you begin feeling the anger and the pain and the remorse and the guilt and all the other reactions we talked about last week. And of course, this is where depression comes in as well. And the third S stands for slow recovery. And that's one thing I gleaned as I read Eric Lindemann. It is a slow process. You remember from last week, we said that grief can last 2 to 3 to even 4 and 5 years, depending on the kind of loss that it is. Let me break grief down for you in maybe a little different way. Grief involves pain. There are 3 kinds of pain, and I'd like to share the first one with you. The first is emotional pain. We talked last week about the fact that there's a lot of anger, there's fear, and you have confusion. You remember I drew the circle for you last week and said there were lots of little arrows inside the circle representing confusing, conflicting, contradictory feelings within the person when they lose. Confusion, that's one of the emotional pains of grief. Loneliness and emptiness and guilt. These are some of the emotional pains. Then you have physical pain. We talked about being sore in the muscles. We talked about this whole idea that people feel very heavy in the chest. One lady said she felt like there was a band of steel being gradually tightened more and more. We also talked last week about the fact that people are so tired they just can't seem to pull one leg after the other. These are physical pains involved in grief. And the third is behavioral pain. For instance, when you go to bed and sleep in the bed alone for the first time instead of sleeping with your spouse who is now dead, there's pain involved, believe me. Or if you go shopping for the first time without that child that is now dead, you see. Or you go shopping and you pass the favorite foods that that individual liked very much, and now that person isn't around to buy the food for. Or you go to church for the first time. That's very, very difficult for some people. Very difficult. This is what I mean by behavioral pains. Now, there are some determinants. There are things that determine how well or how poorly you adjust to a loss. And we need to share those with you tonight. First of all, who died? Was it my mother or was it my great aunt, you see? If a mother dies, it's obvious that you're going to have a more difficult time adjusting to that loss than a great aunt, perhaps, that you didn't even know very well. And then it depends on the nature of the attachment. How close were you? How much did you depend upon that person for your well-being and your welfare? Especially in young people, we find that it's determined by the amount of ambivalence that they have. Especially teenagers. You know, there are teenagers who will say at one point, I hate my father, and then at another point say, I love my father. In their search for independence, they have a great deal of ambivalence. And when a mother or a father dies and they had a lot of ambivalence, they might feel a great deal of guilt and might even blame themselves for the death. I had one young boy who came to me because he was the child in the family that was always fussing and fuming with his mother about how late he would stay out and if he could go out at all and what he could do when he went out. And he said to me, I know that I killed my mother because I'm the one that gave her more stress than any of the other kids, and she died of a heart attack. So his ambivalence and his behavior caused him a problem. Another determinant in how well you grieve and how you react is the mode of death. Was it a peaceful death? Was it a death with a great deal of pain involved? Was it a death that happened, for instance, on the high seas, or did it happen in a hospital where the person was cared for well? That's another determinant. I suppose that we could also talk about grief in another way. I often go back to the old automobile, you know, the Nash car. N stands for natural. If a death is natural, in other words, Grandma lived to be 83, 84 years old. She had a good life, a fruitful life, and you expect that Grandma is going to die when she gets that old. It's much easier to adjust to that kind of a loss. But more difficult than a natural death would be an accidental death, accidental. Probably because you don't have any time to say those last words that you wished you could have said, or undo some things that you did not do very well. So accidental deaths are difficult. And by the way, there are some good studies on this, this whole idea. We have found in some of the studies that if a person has 3 days or less notice, the reactions to loss are twice as intense as they would be if you had more than 3 days notice. Then S would stand for suicidal. The suicidal death is more difficult than the accidental because there's a great deal of guilt involved, you know. You say to yourself, why didn't I pick up on those clues he was giving me? You know, why did I have that argument with him? Why did I not settle things right away? Maybe he committed suicide because of what I did to him or for him. And so suicidal death is a difficult one, and the most difficult is a homicidal death. There are some people who believe that the homicidal death is so difficult because you're putting so much energy into bringing justice to bear on the part of the person who committed the murder that you have very little energy left to actually do the grieving. So that's the NASH, N-A-S-H, natural, accidental, suicidal, and homicidal. And they become increasingly difficult in order as you go down. Then, of course, it depends on where the death took place, as I mentioned before. Was it home? Was it on the high seas? Was it an airplane crash? It depends on how much warning you had and the difficulty of the death. Still another factor involved in how well a person grieves is how well they handled earlier losses. We know in working with grief recovery people that if an individual had a very difficult time with an earlier loss, chances are pretty great that that person will have a difficult time with the present loss. Then too, you have personality types. Some people are just more easygoing and other people are more hysterical in their personality makeup, and one of these is going to have a more difficult time than the other. Then too, you have social and cultural variables. There are some cultures that promote the stiff upper lip approach. You know, if you're an adult, you don't show emotions, you don't express your feelings, and probably the stiff upper lippers are going to have a more difficult time handling their grief. More difficult than the cultures that promote wailing and crying, talking. These people will probably do better. I remember visiting a certain foreign country, And the custom there was to take the person who died, put him or her into a pine coffin, and the pallbearers would carry the coffin on top of their shoulders, and the mourners would gather around in a little tight circle and take little tiny steps all the way to the cemetery. And as they walked to the cemetery, they would wail and they would cry and they would scream, and there were musicians making noise. And probably people in these cultures are able to work through their losses a lot better than those who don't show emotion. I think perhaps the key to the whole thing is that there are no two people who grieve alike. And it really isn't fair to compare yourself to somebody else. Every time we have a grief recovery program, I have to tell people about this. It's so easy to look at the person across the room from you who had a similar loss and say to yourself, my, they're doing so much better than I am. There must be something wrong with me. No. You see, you are very unique. There is no other person in all of the universe just like you. My granny used to say, when God made you, honey, he threw the pattern away. And so you see, I'm unique in the way I grieve, and God is unique in the way he heals me. So it's important not to compare yourself with somebody else. For instance, I had a woman in grief recovery who was very, very talkative, and she expressed her feelings very freely, and she talked about her sadness and her guilt and her anger, and she did very well. I had another lady in grief recovery who came, never spoke a word, never signed any of the application blanks or registration blanks, never filled anything out for me. I never heard her voice. I did not know her name during the whole 5 sessions. And I thought, surely this lady is not going to do very well. But to my surprise, I had a telephone call from her 3 or 4 months later, and she said, you don't know who I am, I'm not going to tell you my name. You never heard my voice before. I'm the lady who dressed in black and came to grief recovery and never said a word. It turned out that her husband was a very, very popular man in town, and she didn't want her identity to be revealed to the people in this group. She did not want to embarrass her husband. But she did well. She picked up the concepts in grief recovery and she used them, and to good advantage. I had one man who made beautiful progress. As I looked at his background, I discovered he had a good range of losses, far enough apart so that healing could take place in this loss before he experienced the next loss. And he was the kind of a fellow who could express himself very well. He did well in grief recovery. Another man had a very difficult time. And he was one of these individuals who had almost no losses in early life, but then began having losses in middle age very close together, and there was no time to work through one before the next loss came along. And he was not an expressive kind of an individual. He didn't share his feelings with anybody. But by doing some one-to-one counseling, we were able to help him to work through his grief. And I think that we must always remember that we must not compare. There's no stereotype in grief. As I said the first night, we're all different. Don't be too hard on yourself. I'd like for you now to pause for a little while. I'm going to ask the facilitator of your group to turn off the video after I tell you what I want you to do. You remember that last week your assignment was to do some thinking about your loss and your relationship with the person who is lost. I ask you to think it over very completely, very thoroughly, and then to keep a journal in which you record your reactions to the grief recovery session and to your exercise of thinking and reviewing the relationship. And what I'd like for you to do, when the facilitator turns off the video machine, I would like for you in your group to talk about what happened this week as you were processing, thinking, and journaling. Thank you for sharing in your group. I'd like to share a study with you that was done among 25 widows. The 25 widows were broken apart into 3 different groups. The one group were people who became very hysterical at the time of the death of a spouse. And these were the individuals who had a very, very rapid cessation of expression of their feelings. They did a study of these people in the first group 1 year after their loss and found that 33% of them were still experiencing moderate to severe emotional disturbances. The second group of people were individuals who had moderate to severe emotional disturbances during the first 1 or 2 weeks of their grief. But interestingly enough, this group of people, after 1 year of grief, only 12.5% of them, 12.5% were still suffering from moderate to severe emotional disturbances. Then they took a third group of people. Out of these 25, these were the people who had almost no or no emotional affect. And they had very poor support system. They were not expressive individuals. And these persons, after 1 year of grief, were found to have 60% of them still suffering from moderate to severe emotional disturbances. So what we really learned from this study is that a person really needs to be expressive, to talk about his feelings, his or her feelings when they're going through loss, and they should allow themselves to go through the grief. Last week we said, don't dam it up. Don't try to stop it. Let the grief flow like a stream down the mountainside. And we find that when people allow the grief to happen early in their experience of loss, when the maximum support is present, they do much better. Now, I think that I probably get this question more than any other question in terms of when should you go to grief recovery? When should you get this kind of help? People say, isn't there a time when it's too soon to begin working through your loss? And my answer is no. Absolutely no. It's never too soon. In the last 6 years, I have people who have suffered from homicidal deaths in their families, suicidal deaths in their families, and I found that in almost every case, these people will come to me later and say, I'm so glad I came. I have some people who come just 1 or 2 weeks after a major loss in their family, and they report that they have effective improvement, noticeable improvement, in a 5-week period. Another thing I must share with you is that it's never too late to come to grief recovery. I'm discovering that people who have had unresolved losses that extend way back 15, 20 years come to this program, and they're able to find new freedom and new space to begin living productively and creatively. Let's talk about depression for just a minute. This becomes a problem for some people. They are afraid that if they begin talking and expressing their feelings, that the depression will deepen. My experience over the last 6 or 7 years tells me that this is not so. If we can get people talking about their feelings, sharing their feelings in an atmosphere where there is adequate support, actually there is a drastic reduction in their experience of depression within a 6-month period. So we don't want you to push the feelings aside or refrain from expressing because you're afraid that you're going to deepen your depression. This really doesn't happen. I'm going to draw a picture for you, and I want you to watch me very carefully. I'm going to draw a picture for you, and when I finish drawing the picture, I'm going to ask you to turn off your video machine and go into your group and talk about what I have drawn. Okay? Here I have a circle, and I draw a second circle on the board. Just imagine that you're looking at a blackboard. I draw one circle, I draw another circle interlocking with the first circle, and then I take my eraser and I erase one of the circles so that all I have left is what looks like a 3/4 moon. Okay, now I've drawn the picture, and I want you to turn off your video machine and begin to talk in your group about what it means. Thank you for discussing in your group. Now let me see if I can guess what some of you said. I imagine that some of you said, well, you had two circles, you erased one of them, leaving sort of a crescent missing in the first circle. That means that when somebody dies that's very close to you, there's a part of you missing. Okay? Maybe some of you said, well, when somebody very close to you dies, you feel like a half a person. You don't feel whole. Maybe some of you did what somebody did in a group I conducted just recently. After 6.5 years of conducting grief recovery programs, for the first time, somebody in the group interpreted my picture drawing this way. They said, there's still something left. I had never had that happen before. Now, I suppose that it does feel that there's something missing, that you're only half of a person. Are you really only half a person? Are you really not whole? Is there a part of you missing? Or is that a perception problem? Most people who discuss this in the groups come up with the conclusion that it's a perception problem. You simply feel like you are less than a whole person, but you really are still a whole person, and you have the capacity to live and to love creatively. On the other hand, there are some people who are very convinced that when somebody very dear to you dies, you will never be the same again, and there'll always be a missing part of you. It was like fitting a round peg into a square hole. You still have some spaces that you can't fill in. And that probably is true. No matter which of these versions you accept, I frankly think there's truth to both of them, but whichever one you accept, the truth of the matter is there is a loss of self-esteem when you lose somebody very, very important to you. And so I'm going to give you an assignment for this next few days before our next session that will attempt to help you to improve your self-esteem, your self-image. I want you to take a sheet of paper. At the top of the sheet of paper, you can say, I am very important, or I am very special. Draw a line across the top, draw a line from the top down to the bottom. On the left-hand side, put the word assets. On the right-hand side, put liabilities. I want you to list all of your assets that you can think of, all the nice personality qualities of yours, your characteristics, your traits, your abilities, your skills. Put those all down. And by the way, if your preacher last Sunday had a sermon on being humble, just forget everything he said. I want you to really talk to yourself about your good points. And then I want you to list your liabilities. Let's not call them liabilities, let's call them your growing edges. Those parts of your life that need improvement. You know, the most tender and vulnerable part of a plant are the growing edges. So let's call liabilities your growing edges. Places where you need improvement. Jot those down on the right-hand side. Now, down below your assets and liabilities, I want you to jot down short-term goals for using your assets and long-term goals for using your assets. On the other side, put down short-term goals for improving your liabilities, your growing edges, and long-term goals. This can be a beautiful exercise that will help you to begin to restructure your identity. And it's a fascinating exercise. Every time people do this exercise, they say they have a difficult time. But it helps you to realize that you still have something left, and it's not so important at this point what you do with what you've lost, because that's beyond your control, but what you do with what is left. Let me just illustrate this. In our grief recovery program years ago, I had a lady who came back the night after I gave this assignment, and she had done her homework. She jotted down as one of her assets as being artistic. A lady in the same group said, I know she's artistic because she was in high school with me, and she is a fascinating painter. She's a good painter. She does her work in oils. And so the lady said, all right, my short-term goal, because I haven't been painting for a long time, my short-term goal is to go down to the Art Center and take a refresher course in oil painting. What do you think her long-term goal was? Her long-term goal was to teach the course in oil painting at the Art Center. I really got a kick out of that. I think it's great. For instance, we had another lady who said that one of her liabilities was that she was too dependent on people. She had never learned to drive a car. She had never had a job outside of her home. So her short-term goal was to learn to drive the car, and her long-term goal was to get a job. And would you believe it? I got a letter 6 months later. She had learned to drive the car, and she got her first job, and she was tickled pink. Fascinating. So I want you to do this exercise for me during this next week and really put your heart into it. I had a woman just a couple of nights ago say to me, do you know something, Larry? I am 53 years old and I have never set goals for my life. But this is the time when I did it. I really set some goals for myself and I feel like I'm going to go places. So this is a good exercise to develop your self-esteem. Now there's one more exercise I want you to do, one more assignment. You remember that last week we sent you home to do lots of thinking about the relationship you had with a person and lots of journaling. I'm going to add 2 more things now to your assignment. Number 1, I want you to do some talking. I want you to talk not just about the details of your loss, I want you to talk about the feelings you have inside about your loss, okay? And I want you to do the talking in a certain fashion. Let's just pretend that your loss is a loss of a spouse. This is the way I want you to talk. I want you to talk, first of all, about the illness, the last illness, or the accident, whatever it was that caused the death and the funeral. Talk about those things, the details and the feelings. Then talk about the late marriage. Then go back and talk about the early marriage. Go back and talk about the courtship, the engagement. Go back and talk about the first time you ever met that person that you called your husband or your wife. Now don't stop there. Continue to talk about the meaningful relationships that you had with people before you ever met that person that you call your husband or wife. You see, if you can understand that you can develop meaningful relationships before you met the person who is now dead, it's a lot easier for you to believe that you can once again develop meaningful relationships now that that person is gone. Okay, so next week, during these coming days, for next week's session, you do lots of talking. And if you don't have anybody at home to talk to, find somebody in your group that will call you on the phone, or you can call them or talk to your facilitator. Then I want you, the 4th thing I want you to do now, in addition to thinking and journaling and talking, I want you to weep. There are so many people that try to choke back the tears. When they need to cry, they try to bury them inside. And I don't want you doing that. Absolutely not. I think it's important that you really let the tears roll. Somebody said that tears are the jewels of remembrance, painful but glistening with the beauty of the past. So let the tears roll when you feel them coming. Now, I'd like to talk about that goal number 4 that we touched on last week. You remember what that was? We said that it was important for your 4th goal to withdraw the emotional energy you had invested in the relationship and reinvest that emotional energy in other relationships. Another way of putting that, as you recall from last week, is that I want you to begin saying goodbye to the relationship as it once existed but can no longer exist. In other words, I'm asking you not to say goodbye to the person, never. I don't want you to say goodbye to the memories. Those are yours to keep forever. And I don't want you to say goodbye to the hopes you have of reuniting with that individual. I want you to say goodbye to the relationship as it once existed but can no longer exist. Let me explain that a little further, the importance of that. If you draw one circle on the blackboard representing you and another circle on the blackboard representing your husband or wife, then you draw an arrow from you to your spouse. You are reaching out to your spouse. Then draw an arrow from the spouse back to you, representing the response that your spouse gives to you. That represents good communication, a good relationship. But now, that spouse dies. You reach out, but that spouse can't respond back to you, and your needs are not met, and you're frustrated. You follow that? So it's very, very important that you begin to say goodbye to the relationship that can no longer exist to prevent this frustration. And it is here in this attempt to keep the relationship going that people plant the seeds of pathology. And so I want you to begin saying goodbye to the relationship. Now, you can't say goodbye to the relationship in one fell swoop. You've got to say goodbye to the relationship in bits and pieces. Let me just tell you how you can do this. It's something like the neighbors that live down the street from you. Just pretend. They've lived there for 20 years, and one day they come and they say, you know, we're moving to California. And they tell you all about the new job and the house they bought out there. When they leave that night, do you say goodbye to them? Is that your final goodbye? No. They're only going to move in 3 months. You wouldn't say goodbye then, would you? No, you would go to the restaurant and have dinner with them. You'd go playing golf. You'd go picnicking. You'd go biking with them or jogging. And you'd talk and have many, many other occasions for socializing and saying goodbye. And then one day the moving van comes along, moves all the furniture into the van, and the family comes over and you hug and you kiss. You say goodbye. They get in the car. You wave. Off they go to California. Is that the end of the relationship? No. When they get to California, they write you a letter every week, and you write them a letter every week. And then a little time goes by, and you receive a letter every month, and they receive a letter every month. And then every 6 months you hear from them, and they hear from you. And every Christmas you get a Christmas card. And one day your wife says to you, or your husband says to you, you know something? We haven't heard from the Johnsons at Christmas time in several years. What happened? Well, you see, they no longer needed you. They withdrew the emotional energy in your relationship, and they had reinvested the energy in other relationships in California. But they did it in bits and pieces. Now, let me illustrate this very carefully for you so that it's clear in your mind what you're going to do during the coming weeks. I had a young lady that I knew. I'll call her name Beverly. Beverly lost her husband in a very tragic accident, and she was having a difficult time adjusting. And so I asked her to say goodbye to her relationship with her husband in bits and pieces. She was very angry, mostly angry at God. She did not want to accept that he was really dead. She did not want to go through the pain, but we helped her to do this by talking it through, like I've encouraged you to do. And finally I said to her, Beverly, it's time now to begin saying goodbye to your relationship with your husband. She began doing this, and she got to the point where she'd said goodbye to every aspect of the relationship, and now she was ready to say goodbye in one final greeting. And this is what she did. She got her journal and she wrote. This is what she said. Oh my God, Johnny, you're dead. I will never see you again in this life. Goodbye. Goodbye. I love you. And then the last sentence in her journal went like this. You know, God, I don't know you very well, but when I get things settled around, I'd like to get to know you better, okay? Her anger at God began to dissipate when she finally said goodbye to the relationship with her husband, and there was room inside for something else. I'll give you one more example of how to say goodbye. And this one really comes home to me because it happened so recently. I'll call her Sandy. Sandy came to a grief recovery program. Her husband was jogging along the road one day, and a man came along in a car, hit him, and continued driving on a hit and run. And she was having a very difficult time adjusting to the loss of her young husband. And as we worked through this whole grief process, Sandy finally came to the place where she needed to say goodbye to the relationship as it once existed, but no longer existed. She was in the potato patch in the fall of the year digging her potatoes. And as she was digging those potatoes, a thought crossed her mind. Oh, Jim and I planted these potatoes in the springtime. Then she remembered how I told her to say goodbye in bits and pieces, saying goodbye to little pieces of the relationship here and there. She began to think thoroughly through that whole situation of planting potatoes in the springtime with Jim. Going to the Farm Bureau to buy seed potatoes and the fertilizer, digging the garden and making the rows, dropping the potatoes and the fertilizer, covering the rows, weeding them, putting bug dust on them, watering them. And then when she thought through that whole process of planting potatoes with Jim in the springtime, she just looked up and she said, Jim, honey, I will never see you again, and I will never plant potatoes with you. We planted these potatoes in the springtime, but now I'm saying goodbye to planting potatoes in the springtime with you, Jim. We will never plant potatoes in the springtime again in this life. Goodbye. I love you. Then she said, Larry, I cried for a half an hour in that potato patch. I'm glad my neighbors didn't see me. They certainly would have thought there was something wrong with me. But after crying for a half an hour, she said there seemed to be a new freedom within me, and there seemed to be a new space for something other than my thoughts of Jim and his death. Sandy worked through that whole process of saying goodbye to the relationship as it existed, and she did a noble job, and her recovery was really fascinating to watch. And so I know it hurts to say goodbye to this relationship, but I want you to really make a good effort to do this. And this is your assignment for the next few days until you come back to our next grief recovery session. And I tell you, friends, you will find a lot of growth taking place. A lot of frustration will just completely evaporate when you begin to say goodbye to the relationship. So take me seriously. I'm emphasizing this a great deal tonight because it is so very important. And now I thank you for coming to Grief Recovery, and I wish you peace.
I appreciate your staying for the spiritual resources in grief recovery. There is a beautiful text that we just have to share today, and that is this. This is the victory that overcomes the world, even our faith. And how much we need victory. We struggle and at times seem overcome. Yet in our hearts, we long to get on top and overcome the challenges we face in this world, don't we? And our text assures us that the key to the victory that overcomes the world is our faith. So what is faith? And how do we go about getting it? As I understand it, faith is a word used in the Bible to describe a relationship with God as with a person well known. And of course, the better he's known, the better the relationship can be. Faith implies an attitude towards God because we know Him as well as we do, an attitude of love and of trust and of deepest admiration. It means that we have enough confidence in God based upon the more than adequate evidence which He has revealed, that we're willing to believe whatever He says because it is God that's speaking. We're willing to accept whatever He offers because it's God who's making the offer. And we're willing to do whatever He asks without any reservation, not only today and tomorrow, but for the rest of eternity. Faith, you see, is the absolute assurance that God is on our side. It is complete trust that believes that if we could see the end from the beginning and understand God's reasons, that we would never choose to be led any other way than God would lead us. And of course, this is where grief poses a serious challenge to our faith, because we often have a hard time reconciling the pain of our loss with the assurance of a loving, supportive, caring God who even now can be trusted to be at our side to help us. We need to be reminded that the evidence of God's love and absolute commitment to us does not come from the events of today or the trauma of yesterday, but rather was established beyond doubt for all time at the cross. It was there at the cross that God demonstrated that He would never abandon us, but would provide at whatever loss to Himself all that was necessary for our best good. You see, God does not force us to love and trust Him. It can't be done without providing evidence upon which to base our faith. And it's evidence that appeals to the reason. Paul said that in Romans 10:17. Faith, he said, cometh by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. Of course, the reason it said hearing rather than reading or studying is because in those days there were only a few handwritten manuscripts of the Bible that were not only too bulky, but too expensive to be kept in one's own home. So if you wanted the key to the evidence of God, you would go to the church or to the synagogue and stand in the courtyard, as was their custom, and listen as the Word of God, the evidence of His character, was read. Of course, today it's different. Today we have our own Bibles. We can read for ourselves. So I believe Paul probably would have modified Romans 10:17 today to say, faith cometh by reading. That is, by a careful study of the Word of God. Now, let's review together some of the glimpses of God that can be seen as Scriptures are read as a revelation of His character, upon which to base our faith, and thus have the victory that overcomes the world. What can we see? What can we know? Surely the clearest picture of God is to be found in that period of human history where God veiled the dazzling splendor of His divinity and came to this earth in human form. What a picture of God the life of Christ reveals. The way He treated people. For instance, there was that man at the Pool of Bethesda. He had been there crippled and chronically ill for 38 years because as a young man he had squandered his health in self-indulgence. And then God came by. For Jesus was God. Now, from my background in health education, I'd say that man deserved a pretty good lecture for having lived that way in his early life. Did he get one? No, he looked up and saw the kindest face he had ever seen. And the kind face said, "Would you like to be well?" And the man said, "I surely would." And so the kind face said, "Well, get up." Now later on, after the man had been healed, Christ came back and said, "You know how you got into that predicament, don't you? I would suggest that you go and sin no more, lest a worse consequence befall you." You see, God often met people in this way. First, He won them to confidence. He accepted them. He helped them. He made them feel comfortable in His presence. But then after He had done that, He might also speak of the other more sensitive areas of a person's life, for they were also a part of the picture. Yes, the life of Christ is such a complete portrayal of God. You remember how the gospel writer John said that if all had been written that could have been written about the life of Christ, the whole world could not contain all the books that could have been written. But this only adds significance to the things that were picked out under inspiration. And some of them were just little things. For instance, after the raising of Jairus' daughter, and all of the people ran out to celebrate, who called out after them, "This little girl is hungry. Wait a minute, give her something to eat." Why, that was Jesus. That's the kind of a person He was. And then there was that conversation with Nicodemus. In essence, Nicodemus was saying, "Jesus, I'd be embarrassed to be seen in public talking with Would you mind seeing me in private after dark? Imagine a human being embarrassed to be seen talking to the supreme creator of the universe. God could have said, of course some people's God would have to say this, Nicodemus, if you're not willing to see me in public, I won't see you. But no, our very gracious Lord said, why, of course, Nicodemus. If that would make you more comfortable, surely I would be happy to see you in private after dark. Think what that says about God. And then one day we see him at the funeral of his friend. And he's crying. God crying at a funeral? And then only moments later, he demonstrated the faithfulness of the words he had spoken earlier to this grieving family when he had assured them, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believeth on me, even though he die, he will live again. And that was what he demonstrated that day. And then think of the last few hours of his own life. There's nothing quite like it in all of Scripture. In fact, this is supposed to be one of the clearest revelations of God that the universe will ever see. He was up all Thursday night, and I'm sure no one brought him breakfast on a tray Friday morning. In fact, they insulted him and made fun of his birth as illegitimate, and one poor wretch stepped up and spat in his face. Did Jesus get angry? Why, it must have been a revolting experience for Christ to be surrounded by beings behaving like that, and there must have come to him the almost overmastering temptation to use his divine power and just blot them out. But he wouldn't do it. And then they hung him on a cross, and he only prayed, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Why, was this because he was weak? Why, no. And when they said, why don't you come off the cross and save yourself? He could have done it. I mean, we couldn't, we humans, but he could have. If you could go up to heaven right now, march in through the pearly gates, stomp up the golden streets, and go up to the throne of God and hit God, spit in God's face, would God be angry? God's face has already been hit. It has already been spat on, for Jesus was God. And he took insults and suffering and death to illustrate to the universe and hopefully to you that he loves you infinitely. He loves you. You see, to see Jesus in this way, we simply have to read the book. There's no other way of doing it. For faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. And this is the victory that overcomes the world, even our faith. Shall we pray? Our Father in heaven, once again we come to you recognizing that you are a being totally worthy of our trust, someone that we can learn to know and recognize that you're on our side. And today, I pray for each one who is here, that they will not only have the victory that overcomes the world, the victory of faith in this life, but that in fact they will live for eternity in response to their faith. These things I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. May the smile of God rest upon you. And may this week find you filled with victory as a result of your trust, your faith in God.